Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this little Opel Blitz truck. This is the 15mm scale snap kit from Zvezda. I built this model recently, and if you want to see that build video, there's a link in the description, and in the upper right corner of the video now. Go check it out. No sense in rambling too much, let's begin the painting. I started, as usual, with priming. I used AK Interactive black primer with microfiller for this. It is a good primer, but feel free to use whichever primer you like. Then I airbrush on a base coat of Vallejo Model Color German Grey. Seems like a good colour for grey German vehicles if you ask me. I spray this all over the vehicle, though because I'm going to paint the canvas covering a different colour, I don't worry too much about getting a good coating there. It's easier to just paint over it later than to worry too much about trying to avoid getting paint on it here. I did a couple of coats with this colour. It is best to do multiple thin coats rather than one thick chunky coat. Next, I mixed roughly 50% model colour pale grey blue with 50% German grey and airbrushed a highlight. This is almost entirely sprayed down from above the truck, though I do also spray a little bit from the sides. The idea here is to create the look of sunlight being above the vehicle. I do want it to be fairly subtle though. After that, it's time for some dry brushing. For this, I use a mix of roughly 3 parts pale grey blue and 1 part German grey. As always, my colour mix is pretty rough. I mix the paint to the point I like how it looks, rather than blindly adhering to some arbitrary ratio. I dry brush this onto most of the sharp corners and edges. It should bring them out a bit and make the model look more worn and used. It also helps to make the detail this model does have stand out a bit more. Being a cheap and small model, some of the detail is a bit simplified, and it's a good idea to try and make up for that with painting. I was trying not to go too far with this dry brushing. I think for the most part I got it just about right and I was pretty happy with it. Next, I painted the cargo compartment's cover thing. For this, I used Vallejo Model Color Beige Brown. I'm sure somebody is going to be upset because this is the wrong colour or something, but I thought it would look good, and I wanted something quite different to the base colour of the vehicle. Obviously, I'm trying to be very careful here to avoid getting this colour onto areas that I want to keep grey. There's a slight gap between the parts here which I found helpful. It also helps to go slowly and carefully here. This isn't a race and I'm not Russian, but even people from Russia shouldn't rush this kind of thing. Ha ha ha, I'm so funny looking. I did this in a couple of thin coats and it is pretty decent looking, though there's a couple of spots where it's a bit thin and the dark from the grey is showing through. I figured these little imperfections would add to the weathering effect. To make this look a bit more worn and used, I applied a rough dry brushing of model colour brown sand. I apply the dry brushing in a few directions, though I do try to mostly apply it in strokes along the truck's direction of travel, that is to say front to back. I did get a little bit of this on the grey, but it's almost unnoticeable, and it should look a bit like a scratch or some dirt instead of paint, I hope. I feel like I got a pretty decent result here, though I think it would look better with a dark wash. But before I apply that, it's decal time. After applying gloss varnish where I wanted the decals, I apply them. Well duh, Herbert. What else would you do? Anyway, I figured a cross on the sides of the cab and cargo compartment would be interesting. Not sure if they really applied markings like this, but this is my model and I'll mark it how I please. Maybe these Germans wanted everybody to be sure that this was a German truck, so they doubled the markings up. This was my first attempt at using Tamiya Mark Fit Strong, and it seems to work very well. I applied it before and after the decals were placed, and I'm pretty happy with it. To be fair, I didn't really notice it behaving any differently to Humbrol Decal Fix, which I've used in the past, but it does come with its own little brush, which I quite like. For those curious, the decals are by Plastic Soldier Company. The smaller ones are from a 15mm set, and the larger ones are from a 1/72nd scale set. Then it's time for that wash. This is a mix of roughly 50% Army Painter Strong Tone and 50% water. I kind of slopped this on all over the truck and I am fairly rough with it, but I'm also trying to prevent the wash from pooling up too much. Leaving this stuff on too thick creates tide marks when it dries, and that doesn't look very good. Though arguably it could look realistic on top of the canvas covering, you know, to kind of represent that water has been sitting there for a while and has dried up. The effect of the wash is kind of subtle, but I feel like it improves the model quite a bit. Then I figured maybe a little bit of chipping was in order. I wanted this truck to look reasonably new, so I didn't want to go overboard with this. Instead of doing sponge chipping like I usually would, I'm just going to use a fine brush. The colour I've used here is a mix of 3 parts Vallejo Model Air Black Grey and somewhere between 1 and 2 parts model colour Mahogany Brown. It looks a bit more brown than I would usually make this mix, and that's so that it stands out a bit against the grey base colour. As you can probably see, I'm mostly applying this along edges and gaps where I feel like there would be chipping. I put a fairly big scratch on the roof and I thought that might have been a bit too big, but it sort of grew on me. Adds a little bit of interest. I didn't really add any of this to the cargo compartment because I believe that's made out of wood. I didn't really feel like adding anything to represent chipped wood, so maybe it's just really new. Once I was happy with that, I moved on to the tyres. I painted these with AK Interactive rubber tyres, which has come to be my favourite colour for things like tyres. I'm obviously adding this to the tyres. Insert hilarious joke about that being surprising here. I'm trying to be pretty careful with this, but it doesn't have to be perfect. We can always make corrections later, so don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's how we learn and improve. The difference between the colour of the tyres and the German grey is fairly subtle. They are different, but when right up against each other it isn't so obvious, at least in my opinion. So the next thing I did was to paint the rims of the wheels with Vallejo model colour London Grey. The idea with this is to break up the 2 darker grey colours and make the wheel rim visually pop, while also, hopefully, making it look as though it's been scuffed up a bit. It's pretty simple, but I think it's effective enough. Again, this is something to do slowly and carefully. I made a few errors, but really it was no big deal. I corrected them afterwards. Then, to add a bit of interest, I figured it was a good idea to apply a bit of rusty colouring to the frame and suspension. I used AK Interactive Rusty tracks for this because, well, it makes sense, doesn't it? Not that they're tracks, but it is rusty, so, you know, why not use a colour called Rusty Tracks? This paint is pretty thin, and I'm not trying to get a solid coating with it. I do want a bit of the grey to show through. I roughly put it on all the relevant parts, those being the frame, leaf springs and axle bits. I'm not too worried about being a bit messy with it either. This is pretty simple stuff, and I will add a little bit more to it with the enamels, but before I apply those, I give the entire model a coat of gloss varnish to protect all of the acrylics. I could have painted the windows at this point, but I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do with them. I did want them to be pretty clean though, so doing them after the weathering seemed like a good idea. I applied AK Interactive Landing Gear Wash. I kind of like this as just a generic dark colour. The Opel Blitz clearly doesn't have any landing gear, or does it? I mostly try to put this in the gaps and corners on the grey areas, also the wheels. I'm avoiding the canvas top. I remove and reapply this until I'm happy with how it looks. I do want it to be kind of subtle. Once I felt happy with it, I put some AK Interactive Track Wash on my brush. Then I dip it in cleanish thinner, and then I apply it to places like the frame of the truck. I also put a little bit of it on the wheel hubs. It looks like slight rust or maybe some dirt. At this scale it can be hard to tell those apart. Then I added a little bit of AK Interactive Light Rust Wash. I figured a couple of little rust highlights around the frame and some very light spots on the wheels would be a good idea, and I'm pretty sure it was. My light rust wash is pretty old and has thickened up quite a bit. It's more of a sludge now, but it still works well enough for this purpose. Anyway, when I was satisfied with what I'd done, I applied some more gloss varnish, and then it's window time. I wanted to do something fairly simple, but a little more than just painting them black or dark blue. I started out painting them with Vallejo Model Air black. It wasn't too hard to paint this onto the side windows, there's plenty of raised details surrounding them to act as a guide, but this isn't the case for the windshield, so I went slower and more carefully there. I think I got it neat enough. Then I apply Model Air blue. I thinned this out just a little bit, even though the Model Air colours are pretty thin out of the bottle. I did one initial coating all over the black areas. Then on the side windows I focused the blue along the top and in the forward upper corner. And on the windshield, I applied across the top and down both sides. It does take a few coats to get this to start being visible, and I tried to apply it in a gradual gradient, though it doesn't have to be perfect. I add a little bit of extra blue with Vallejo Model Color Prussian Blue. This is also thinned out quite a bit because I was trying to be subtle. I apply it in the same areas as the darker blue, but I'm staying much closer to the window frames. It turned out a little less subtle than I really wanted, but that's okay. The final thing I did was to add a couple of little, I guess you would call them slashes of colour. For this I used Model Color Sky Blue, and I thinned it out quite a lot. I wanted this to go on really lightly. Looking at the model you can see that I got better as I went along. The left side looks kind of bad, the windshield is okay, and the right side is good. I'm sure other people do windows a lot better, but I just wanted to do something quick that was a bit more interesting than just plain black. At this scale I didn't think it would be worth spending too much time on. I did make a couple of minor corrections with the Model Air Blue, and then I decided that I was done. I finished it by applying a coat of AK Interactive matte varnish. I also brushed some gloss varnish onto the windows, just to give them a nice reflective look. Might as well use some real shininess as well. And with that, the Zvezda 15mm scale Opel Blitz truck is now painted, and ready for war. Am I happy with how it's turned out? Yeah, for the most part, I think it's pretty good. It's fairly simple, but there's nothing wrong with that. It looks pretty clean and relatively new. Maybe it's carrying new troops to the front for the first time ever, or something like that. So yeah, I like it, and it's something I don't do all that often, a truck. Tanks are awesome and fun of course, but trucks are pretty important too. I mean, to a real army anyway. Our wargaming forces can get away without using any. But they are nice to have, and even nicer when they're painted. I suspect this one truck by itself probably won't really be enough for my German Flames of War army, but I did only buy one of these. I'm thinking about getting a set of the Plastic Soldier Company Opel Blitzes next, but that's for another video. Right now I'm waffling so we can watch this truck go round and round. Whee! Anyway, I'm pretty sure most of the stuff I've done in this video is fairly basic, but I do hope there's something helpful you can get out of it. Even if it's just a reminder that going slowly and carefully will help you get better results if you're painting something that needs to be nice and neat, or anywhere really. For those who are interested, I'll include a list of the paints I've used in this video in the description. Feel free to do whatever you like with that information. So, what do you think of this model? Have you painted one of these of your own? If so, maybe you would like to share it with our Discord community. We would love to see it. And of course, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to all of the things including my Patreon and Twitch channel are in the description below. You can also find the join button down there. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thank you for watching. Farewell.